There we go. Nice. Cool. Let's go and keep going. Okay, so those of you who actually have attended our meetings in the past, you know that we have kind of a routine. And the first thing that I want to do is to kind of go through a few housekeeping things, including kind of news and announcements, what's happening around Microsoft BI that I found interesting since the last time we met, which was February 1st. Those of you who are joining for the first time, our group meets on a monthly basis, usually on the first Monday of the month, unless that falls on a holiday of some kind. So I talked about this the last time, but I just want to kind of reiterate this, that you probably have previously, our group was affiliated with organization called Microsoft Pass. Many of you probably have been to the Pass Summit, and you probably heard the news that they actually sunset their operations. So we lost that website, but then, you know, our primary website now is a meetup, and a lot of you should be registered there. If you're not, please take a moment to register. And then with a secondary site, which Microsoft actually, an organization called Dynamic Communities, really encourage us to join, because that's more kind of a Power BI oriented focus. You can also take a moment to register on that one. So at this point, I really don't see much benefit, to be honest, to actually join dynamic communities. They have some discussion lists, but they have good plans. They're actually re-architecting the website. So maybe there's going to be more and more kind of interesting stuff coming up there. So one thing that I'm using their site for is to publish the slides, the meeting slides that I'm showing right now, because Meetup unfortunately doesn't allow us to upload resources. We can only upload photos. So we got to figure out where to put all of these slides and everything that presenters share. We're going to be working on that. But meanwhile, I'm putting the presentation slides only, not the speaker slides. The speaker slides, it really depends on the speaker. So for the time being, we're going to rely on them sharing the content through their blogs or whatever. After each meeting, if you like, spread the word. Recordings, we started kind of recording our meetings since we went virtual, and you can find them on this URL in here, https://bit.ly Atlanta BI recordings. So this is where you can download the recording of this meeting and prior meetings. Sponsors, right now the situation kind of took care of it. Speakers though, always looking for speakers. If you have something to share, small or big, 1 hour presentation or a tip, let me know. Always looking for speakers. And we also take donations, when we start meeting again, if we run out of sponsors, organizations that buy us food, then maybe we can use these donations. So it's a good idea to contribute whatever small amount you've got. I mean, who knows when we're going to go get back in person, but definitely would help. Jobs. Does anybody have any job opening that you guys want to advertise and share with the community? Is anybody looking for BI talent?
Hey, Teo, this is Clay Keller. My company, Aspirant Consulting, is hiring. I'll throw something in the meeting chat momentarily.
Excellent. So yeah, please feel free to put on the chat window. Anybody else got some cool opening? Cool BI stuff. Anybody? Guess that's it. All right. Well, if you do, please feel free to put it in the chat window. Next on the agenda is the events that could inspire some interest, all of them virtual. But we have Microsoft Ignite actually starting tomorrow. Microsoft Ignite is the biggest Microsoft conference, a replacement of TechEd, and it's going to go this week. It's a free virtual event. There's no reason not to register to get access to all of these sessions. They're going to be out there. Quite a few BI sessions, I imagine. So highly recommend you actually check it out, myignite.microsoft.com. And then on April 6th, we have Microsoft Business Application Launch Event, which James Phillips, who used to be actually the guy who was behind Power BI, now went to Dynamics, kind of heading the Power Platform division at Microsoft, was very excited about this morning. So I caught this event this morning. Apparently they have some news and announcements. If you guys using Dynamics, especially, and the rest of the Power Platform, Power BI, Power Automate, Power Apps, virtual agents, might be a good thing to take a look at that event to actually register. And then speaking about Power BI only, we have the Power BI Summit, which is going to be next month, April 19th to 23rd. That one actually is going to be paid event, $98 the last time I checked. And the website is globalpowerbisummit.com. So 3 events. Does anybody have anything else to share? If you do, please feel free to announce it.
Yep. Teo, I shared a link in chat to dax.do, which is the new web-based DAX formatter editor trial thing from the SQL BI guys. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that at all.
No, I missed that. What does it do?
Basically, it lets you. They give you a sandbox database, Katoso database, and you can write DAX against it and test it out and see how it will, format it, debug it, see how it works.
Nice. Very good. Good tip. Thank you, Eric. dax.do, SQL BI. Awesome. Spirit Consulting is hiring. All right, very nice. Cool. News. Since the last time, what are the most important highlights that caught my attention? Power BI leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Microsoft actually is a leader, but Gartner, I think, cares the most about Power BI. So we can say Power BI is the leader. So the distance is increasing between Tableau and Microsoft. That makes me very happy, actually. But what does it mean for you guys? Yeah, it's an endorsement. If your CEO saying, okay, why should we use Power BI? What do? Quick as a bunny, you point to the Gartner quadrant, Magic Quadrant, and say, okay, where's the dot? Who is on top? Microsoft is on top, right? There's actually a report behind it. Gartner kind of compares these vendors, pros and cons, who's the best, who's the worst. Definitely good read. Then we have Power BI Enhanced Security. So a lot of organizations, actually security, in my life, my line of work, I really hate security, and it's getting more and more difficult. In the past, I used to get admin access everywhere, wasn't a problem. Now nobody gives me admin access anymore, right? So everybody is worried about security. So Power BI also enhancing security. What does it mean? Well, we have some now we support something called private link. What does that mean? It means that you can access Power BI through your private network without having actually to go on the internet. And also we have something called VNet support, which actually goes the other way. Power BI can access your data sources on-prem without requiring gateways. So imagine you're getting data from on-prem database of some kind. Previously, you got to install a gateway. There is no way, one way or the other. But now it will be interesting how that's going to evolve, because if we have VNet, if we have a private VNet, it looks like we actually can avoid those gateways, which is something that makes me very excited. Actually, I can make a career of gateways, problems with gateways. So maybe that's not such a good thing for me. Then we have a Power BI object level security. Now, what is that? Well, if you have done work around Power BI, you know that we have something called row level security. And row level security is what? Limiting what the user can see. You know, maybe Theo can see everything when they connect to my beautiful report, but maybe Eric can see only a portion of the data, right? So this is called row level security. But then what about if I say, oh, revenue, if I have a revenue measure, only can be accessed by sales department or maybe marketing department or whatever. Nobody else can see that measure. Nobody else. So this is actually column level security. All right. So we had that for a while in analysis services, and it has limitations. To be honest with you, it's not that flexible as I want it to be. And since Power BI behind the scenes, it's analysis services, we're going to talk a little bit more in the main presentation. So now actually we have an object level security in there too. It works in the same way as analysis services object level security. And it has, I believe, the same limitations based on what I understood. There is no UI. If you go to Power BI Desktop, try to find where it is, you're not going to be able to find it. So this is another feature besides calculation groups that will require actually using a community tool called Tabular Editor to actually configure it, right? And then if you are, so here's a scenario, very common scenario actually. The organization has Power BI embedded, Power BI for internal usage, but sooner or later, management is going to say, we have partners and we want you to get these Power BI reports and put them for external use. And that external use could be very complicated. It could be you want to allow the user to use Gmail, Hotmail emails, they're not on your domain, right? And you don't want to pay too much money, right? Nobody wants. So I can support maybe the whole internet out there, put some kind of a Power BI report that everybody can see, but for free. I don't want to pay $10 per user per month. So we have this technology in Power BI called Power BI Embedded, which has completely different licensing. It's actually designed for external usage. And the best way to get started, it requires developer effort. So you have to basically see if I can put that link in here somewhere. So you have to write some code. Typically, the way it works is that you create a web application, like a web portal, using .NET or Java or whatever you want, and then you embed reports in that application, so the users don't even have to know that those are Power BI reports. So what changed around this is that now we have a new playground, we have a sample before, but this one is better. It's pretty cool, really nice the way Microsoft actually has done it. So maybe to show you a little bit of that, I go here and I say, maybe I want to use a sample report. I can bring my report, but maybe I can use Microsoft sample. And what I really like about it is that when I go there, I'm going to get my report embedded in this lower pane eventually, I hope. But Power BI Embedded comes with JavaScript APIs that do a lot of stuff, right? So there is a JavaScript APIs, for example, to do paging, to navigate from one page to another page. And if you want to test those things, all you have to do, for example, let's say I want to show the report in the full screen, right? When the user clicks the report, I want to show it in the full screen. So I just drag this API here, I drop it in there, it generates a code for me, and then I can go ahead and run it. And then if this works, you're going to see the report actually, well, maybe it doesn't work so well, or maybe I have to put it, maybe I didn't put it in the right place, maybe it has to be in there. Yeah, not much effect here. Anyway, so you can drop and drop things, you can test it. So developers will probably appreciate this new playground, Power BI embedded playground. What else we got? search bar in Power BI Desktop. How is that useful? What does that mean for me as a Power BI Desktop user? So now we have this search bar over here. And the thinking here is that, you know, novice users to Power BI Desktop, they don't know where to find things. All right, so we have a search in the fields. We have search when we go to the format pane, so we can find properties. So for example, if I want to churn all wrapping, you know, what I can do right now, I don't have anything on the report, so I cannot show you anything, of course. But if I do, it will show me all the settings that that actually have wrap in them. So now we also have the ability to search for features. For example, if I want to do a new quick measure, then I just type quick, and this is basically a shortcut for creating a quick measure. So you can search for commands, Power BI Desktop, using this new search feature. Then we have a model view updates. Model view updates. So if I take a look at this model that I have in here, I have a few tables. Previously, so basically, what do we mean by model update? We basically mean that the field list now become a little bit different, hopefully more intuitive. There are a new set of icons. There are some new functionality in here that was previously only available in the relationships window. So Microsoft started in here, that was in preview, and now the same presentation of the metadata made it to the other tabs in Power BI Desktop. So if you read that article, you'll see what they changed, new set of icons, some new features in the field list. Please feel free to explore. Any questions about this? No questions. Clear as a mud. Cool. So today we're going to talk. I'm going to talk about implementing semantic models. Our next meeting is going to be on April 5th, and that's going to be about report design principles. Eugene is going to present that one. Okay. That's all for the intro. Are we on time? Yes, we're doing just great. Any questions? Please feel free. It's going to be a little bit difficult for me to follow everything that is going on, but I'll try to be a discipline and take a look every now and then in the chat window, see what's going on there. If you have any questions, please feel free to share them. Great. So let's now get to the cool stuff in here, the main presentation. Switch slides a little bit, maybe close this, and get to the main slides. Okay, there we go. Cool. So this is about implementing semantic models. So if you have followed BI for a while, let's say for the past 10, 15 years, you probably have noticed that things have changed quite a bit. Now, 10 years ago, and I know that because, when I started on my BI kind of career was back in 2004, my path was actually through a technology called reporting services, which is kind of near and dear to my heart. This is how I became MVP and all that. But back then, when you say BI, people meant certain things. You have your database. Some people had data warehouses, but those were very rare things to come by. Typically, you'll have some kind of a source database, and you want to create some reports on top of that. And back then, Cognos, Crystal reports, and later reporting services, circa 2004, came in. to solve that problem, how do we create reports and how actually we share these reports with other users? And that worked for a while, but there were a few issues with this approach, having like a CAN reports going against the database. Number one, they were not interactive. Back then, that wasn't a big problem. Nobody knew that actually better things existed as a reporting tool. But another big problem was that there was a lot of development effort. Everybody who tried one of these tools, that you have to be a developer. You have to know quite a bit about how to, create reports, layouts, and things like this. How to write SQL, just to get something. And the moment you get the report, people are going to start saying, I want actually to see this broken in a different way, grouped by in a different way, maybe more details, something like. So the IT, department in the bigger organizations, they were constantly caught in a vicious cycle to create more and more reports. So, and the more reports you create, CAN reports like this, every report becomes management liability, maintenance liability. You have to maintain it, you have to enhance it. And the other thing was that, there wasn't a single version of the truth. You have a calculation here, you got a calculation that does the same thing over there, and then you update this one, the other one's not updated. So much about single version of the truth. So anybody who actually had traveled that road knows about this. And the way we, I guess, the technology decided to address some of these shortcomings is to kind of introduce another layer between the data source and the user. And that layer, I call it, Microsoft used to call it, I don't think they call it that anymore, business intelligence semantic model, but I really like that as a term, and also makes you kind of, if not for anything else, makes you kind of feel a little bit important when you go to the organization, ask them, do you guys have a semantic model? And they start looking at each other. Do we have a semantic model? Let's say we have a data warehouse, have reports, have Power BI, got no semantic model. You guys have to have a semantic model. So this is the consultant here speaking, right? Cool. So this presentation is going to be about semantic models, right? And before we go any further, I want to let you know that you can download the slides from this link. As I mentioned before, we're still trying to figure out where to actually put these documents. For the time being, you can go and download it, go to this blog, and there's a link there to download the presentation deck if you want to get it. Cool. Now that I got this off my chest, the most important slide. Who's Theo, right? So a lot of you, I know, many of you actually follow us for 10 years, this group since I started in 2004. Probably many of you still believe that actually I'm a Microsoft employee, right? He must be from Microsoft. He's talking about Microsoft technology, must be from Microsoft. But actually I'm not. I'm actually an independent consultant, making my living from consulting and training through my company called Prologica, right? So in a nutshell, we help organizations make sense of data in one way or the other. Typically, we are called for kind of data integration, building data warehouses, semantic models, right? In one way or the other, as we're going to see in this presentation. Training, all sorts of Power BI, admin, DAX, modeling. Power BI gets a lot of attention nowadays. I'm quick to announce, Microsoft hasn't announced yet, but really excited about that. So I got recognized as what Microsoft called fast track solution architect for Power BI. According to Microsoft, there are about 30 architects worldwide, and that's a title they bestow on me. I'm really appreciate it. And also I've been something called Microsoft Data Platform MVP for 15 years, right? Through my community work, books that I've written, and all of this stuff, all right? And the group, guys attending, Atlanta BI group, actually I started that in 2010, and it's actually more than a decade. Really like how this group actually has been going, really happy about that. My latest book, Power BI, 6th edition. So my book actually My first Power BI was the first one that came, when Microsoft revamped Power BI in 6 years ago. And since then, I got in the habit every time, every year toward the end of the year when the things quiet down, go and actually revise it. So by the number of editions of my book, you can actually find out how old Power BI is, right? So 6 years, we had the new Power BI, right? Cool. So if you need help, to wrap up my shameless self-promotion, if you need help any form or fashion, let me know. Around SQL Server, BI, or whatever, should be able to help. Cool. So what is a semantic model? Now that we introduced this fancy term, oh, by the way, when you semantic model, then people start, people think, as I said, they start asking themselves, what is a semantic model? Do we have it? Somebody say, is that a cube? And then I say, okay, yeah, we can say that, although nowadays we don't use the term cube all that much for a couple of reasons. Number one, we want to differentiate from the old OLAP technology. It's old now. And number two, we just want to actually, as I mentioned, introduce a fancy word here. But semantics, the word semantics means discover the meaning of the message behind words, right? So remember when I was telling you, okay, you have this report, scan reports going against the database. How do we actually meet this challenge of IT always creating more and more reports? So the simplest solution, you're gonna say business user, here is, I create a semantic model for you. I made it very intuitive, so I name the fields the way you want them to be named to give you a nice end user perspective. Go ahead and create your own reports, right? So from the end user standpoint, this is what the user is going to interact with to create their own reports, if you want them to do that. From our perspective, from the modeler perspective, the person who creates this BI artifacts, essentially this semantic model will allow us to translate machine-friendly database structures. So typically when you go and work with even data warehouses, but source systems, those things have some system names that nobody can figure out what they mean. Your job as a modeler is to translate these machine-friendly database structures into kind of a user-friendly layer that users can relate to, right? Clear as a mud at this point what semantic model is? Probably not. Let's go and maybe we'll clarify it. So why do we need it? To promote ad hoc reporting, right? So we have that layer. Users can create, they can connect their own. In fact, in Microsoft BI, they're not limited to Power BI reports. There are still many Excel users. If you're creating something for finance, let's say financial department, these people love Excel. So ideally, what we want to do, our semantic model to be open for different reporting tools. If you want to use Tableau, if you want to use SSRS, we should be able to do that. We build that model once, and we can use multiple tools to connect to it. The second thing, we want to avoid writing queries. So the tools nowadays, as you know, have reached a point where, for the most part, they don't require the modeler to do we have any questions? Modeler actually to create queries. Yeah, is it hard to stop saying cube? Yep. Give us better performance. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And also allow us to centralize calculations, centralize security. So if you hear the term single, actually, I'm going to postpone discussing single version of the truth because as you're going to see in a moment, there are different ways actually to build semantic models. So we're going to talk about that. Speaking about this, semantic models come in a different shapes and forms. So in Microsoft BI, most of the work we do today is in Power BI, analysis services, technologies like this. But in a nutshell, I'm going to emphasize this later on a little bit more. There's a slide. Behind the scenes, no matter what tool, no matter who does it, eventually that ends up to be the same technology. It ends up to be, we end up to be, from technology standpoint, the same thing. So it really, when we say that they come in different shapes and forms, we really mean who implements it. Is that a business user? Is that a professional, hopefully? And what is the vision and the scope behind that semantic model? Now, how far that semantic model needs to go? Is it a business user focusing to solve a particular problem at the time? Or is it IT, for instance, that says, we're going to actually implement an organizational-wide semantic model? So in Microsoft BI, the technology that we use to implement the semantic models in different shapes and forms are layered, are based on a technology called analysis services. So going back to the cube, maybe traveling a little bit kind of in the memory lane back in time, initially, we had long time ago, before Power BI, before in-memory technologies, we had a technology called OLAP, OLAP cubes. Nowadays, Microsoft calls this technology multidimensional. So if you had a data warehouse, you build a cube on top of that, that was your semantic model, and then use a language called MDX. But things have changed. Users found this technology very complicated, was difficult. There was also was very inflexible. So with the advance of in-memory technologies like Tableau, Power Pivot, and so forth, Microsoft actually side by side introduced another technology called Tabular, right? So initially that technology debuted in Power Pivot for Excel, and later became the bedrock of analysis services, the second flavor of analysis services that now we call tabular. Now, the good thing about, even if we don't want to go that deep, the good thing about these two technologies is that they share the same query languages. So if I have a MDX client, they can talk to both multidimensional and tabular. And if I have a DAX client, a client that generates DAX like Power BI, that client can also talk to multidimensional and tabular. So Microsoft had this nice layer in here that allows us to do it. So what does it mean for you? It means for you that no matter how you implement a semantic model, let's say you decide to deploy to Power BI. What that means is that any legacy client that can generate MDX like Excel doesn't know a thing about DAX. Excel, when you connect Excel to a Power BI dataset, it says, oh, this smells and looks like a cube, right? So it must be a cube. So I'm going to ask for measures. I'm going to ask for dimensions. And that can get you into trouble, as we're going to talk about in a moment. But the good thing is that we can connect Excel to our models, and it works. I can get Tableau also, who doesn't know much about DAX as far as I know, and it probably is going to work to a point. And also I can get Power BI connected to an old-fashioned multidimensional cube, and maybe it's going to work. But typically, from performance standpoint, we would like to use the native query language. So if we're going to go this path, the tabular path, we would like to have ideally a Power BI client that can generate DAX, because that's the native language. The interesting thing is that a long time ago, I did some performance measurement about MDX and DAX. And to be honest, at that point, I couldn't find much difference in performance. If I come from an MDX client or DAX client and hit tabular, was probably performing the same. So Microsoft did very good job, I would say, there. But we should use the client ideally that actually generates the native language. So the long story short, today, at least in my line of work, I use tabular probably 95% of the time. But there are cases where I still need to reach to multidimensional, although I'm actually start forgetting it very, very fast since everything I do is Power BI. So there are some scenarios where we don't have in Power BI and we don't have in tabular. One of them is write back. So a few actually years ago, a client wanted to do a solution for budgeting and forecasting. They didn't want to buy Hyperion because Hyperion starting point is $500,000 right there, right? So it was too expensive, right? They were a middle-sized company. They wanted to do though something that is different than Excel, because Excel, you can do anything, but can get you in trouble very quickly. So what do? We did actually multi-dimensional cube with all the calculations and worked very nicely, actually. So we did that with multi-dimensional. Complex calculations. Back to this project, that some of the requirements were very, very complicated. Like, for example, they wanted to have what we call recursive calculation. Imagine you have a revenue calculation, average revenue or something like this, and that needs to recurse. It needs to call back on itself to project what's going to be the revenue for. So like for every cell, Excel can do that. Every cell can reference to itself or to, so you can do this kind of recursive calculations. We don't have that in tabular, right? But we in multidimensional, I can reference the same measure. So I can do recursive calculations, right? So, however, the the target area for multidimensional is relatively small. So everything that we do nowadays, most of it is actually on the tabular implementation path. Does this make sense so far? You guys nodding? That's great. There is no question so far. I'm sure there's going to come. Okay, so we talked about tabular as a technology, which is this in-memory thing. And that technology became so important. In fact, I would say probably the most important product in Microsoft portfolio that I can think of is SQL Server, one of their best products, although some may argue that actually it wasn't their product. It started with Sybase, but still SQL Server is very popular. I would say the next important probably product we have in the Microsoft portfolio is analysis service, especially today, because that technology, that in-memory technology, made it in so many different places. It started with Power Pivot right here, then now is in Power BI service, Power BI Desktop. Developers, they use this technology to implement on-prem analysis services, tabular solutions, Azure analysis services, that's a platform as a service offering if you're looking for cloud deployments. And finally, in Power BI as well. So in fact, this note that I have at the bottom is probably very important if you're kind of new to this. So no matter what tool you use, no matter if you're a business user, creating Power BI Desktop, using Power BI Desktop to create some small semantic models, or if you're an organizational developer, no matter what tool you use, eventually when you publish your creation, that becomes a database, tabular database, hosted in one of the tabular permutations, either on-premise analysis services, Azure analysis services, Power BI, or SharePoint, although nowadays I haven't seen anyone using SharePoint, Power Pivot in SharePoint anymore. So the only exception, so this technology also in memory technology made it into something called column store indexes. So how is that? Why I'm mentioning this? Because this is actually very important. If your requirement is to build real-time BI, there is no time, the data is always arriving. There is no time to refresh the semantic model / cube. There is no time for you to do that. So typically the way actually we do meet this requirement is by implementing direct query. But if you have a lot of data, performance is going to suffer. So what you can do though, one of the simplest things you can do is to create something called column store index, which is in memory index. It uses the same technology that Tabular uses, but it's kind of inside SQL Server. And the good thing about this is that you don't have to refresh. SQL Server does it behind the scenes for you. A new data come in the table, that index is updated just like any other index. How they do it, I have no idea. But they do it for you. However, because there is no modeling environment, there is nothing for you to do in, by the way, the engine, this in-memory engine is called Vertipack. That was the old name. Microsoft then renamed it to XVelocity. So that in-memory engine is also available in SQL Server column store indexes, but this is not considered business intelligence semantic model because there is no modeling in there. So some of you probably know a lot of this. I don't know, you guys getting a lot of value, but hopefully later on when we progress, you will learn tips, something that I use that maybe will inspire interest. So let's talk a little bit now what we call self-service BI. What is self-service BI? You've got business users. IT is caught up in a never-ending backlog of requests. They don't have time, so they say, business user, you're on your own. You've got this beautiful technology called Power BI. You gotta build your own self-service things, including semantic models. So this slide, I'm not gonna go through it, but kind of compares Excel and Power BI Desktop because, as I mentioned, the technology, this in-memory technology that I talked about started with Excel, but Excel did not work very well for Microsoft. Initially, it had big plans. There are so many users using Excel. Let's go and put this in Excel, and we're going to open BI for everyone, and people are going to buy SharePoint left and right because we're going to charge them. It's going to be free in Excel, but when they publish it, this is where we're going to charge them. But it didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work, the Excel path so well, is there are several reasons. Number one, Excel wasn't designed for BI. It's very difficult for user to go and figure out what to do to start BI going. Number two, Excel had its own release path. Meanwhile, technologies like Tableau, Click, other vendors were kicking our butt left and right. So they were doing great things. We couldn't keep up. So Microsoft said, forget about the Excel. Well, actually, not forget about it. We're going to still keep it there if you want to use it. But now we're going to actually decouple BI from Excel. And we're going to come with this new tool called Power BI Desktop, which is only designed for BI. So that was the story. That's how actually we have these two tools. But a lot of the stuff that you have in Power BI Desktop, you have in Excel. Things like Power Query, the modeling environment, although it's not on the latest, it's still there. And there are some things in Excel that we don't have in Power BI. One of them, for example, is object model for automation. So in Excel, we can do macros to automate stuff. In Power BI Desktop, today, not so much. We can extend it, really. So this is for you to explore if you decide to compare them. So now I would like to share. So as I mentioned, I've been doing quite a bit of consulting and training around Power BI. And I actually started compiling like a list of best practices. Maybe this is the abbreviated version based on what I've seen people do. So a big problem. So let's say you're a business user. You have Power BI and want to create your semantic model. So your boss tells you, Theo, you are here in the marketing department, right? So we have to actually create reports. People are, thirsty for BI. And you're going to do it. You're a business user, you're going to do those things, right? So then inexperienced users, business users, when they're tasked to do this, immediately start thinking about reports. What reports I need to produce at the end, which is not a bad idea to start with the end in mind. But the problem that I see is that, let's say they have a summarized report and they want to have a detailed report. So what they do, they start creating data set per report view. So one data set for this, another data set for that. There are no joins between the data set. Sometimes I see they cram everything into a single data set. So those things are not a good practice. and maybe it will take a lot of maturity from your users to reach a, because basically what you're asking them to do, if they're to follow best practices, you are asking them to become a data warehouse modeler. They have to know about dimension data, they have to know about fact tables, they know how to join them, right? So that could be too much to ask. That's one of the dangers of self-service BI. And I can go through this, why this is bad practice, right? So what will happen, for example, if we cram everything into a single data set? This may work to a point. Imagine you are analyzing revenue and you put the product dimension, you put the customer, everything in one table, right? Life is very simple. Don't need to know about joins, don't need to know anything. But sooner or later, this is going to, crumble. And when it's going to crumble is when the user, for example, your manager tells you, let's now compare actual with budget. And budget, that's a completely different story, has a completely different grain. Maybe your budget per month, maybe your budget per business unit. Now you got to be able to correlate actual and budget. You can't do it. So this is where you start, breaking into a table and things. So at the very beginning, the best practice, you probably guys have heard this, but if the best practice for modeling for self-service and organizational is to use something called star schema. What does star schema means? Without going too much into details, it means, oh, I closed my Power BI desktop. Okay, maybe I can open it again. Actually, we're going to go through a demo later on. It means that we want to break things into separate tables. So I'm going to have a table for customer, table for product, my invoice line table. I'm going to create joins, and life's going to be beautiful because now I have a very flexible model. Another thing, another best practice here is that to adopt the mentality, you model once, you create your data set. So even if I'm a business user and I worry only about my subject area, marketing, sales, whatever it is, the good idea is to think about creating that data set, that modeling once. Have a data set that has multiple tables that represents your actual, your budget, and so forth, and then create multiple reports on top of that. In fact, what I typically do, I split reports from the model. So maybe somebody is responsible only for the modeling piece, only for tables, for measures. And then other people actually can create reports on top of that. So kind of separation of duties might be a good idea. We're going to talk about Tabular Editor to speed up development in a moment when I go through the demo and start comparing these tools. And so I'm going to postpone that. And the other practice here is to create explicit measures. Why? Actually, let me postpone that as well when I get to the demo about explicit measure. And I'll tell you what explicit measure is and why we need it, which is right now. So those of you who haven't seen Power BI Desktop or kind of new to the technology, this might be an interesting demo. And after that, once I create the basic model, semantic model, then I'm going to introduce some additional tools that you might find useful that I typically use. But imagine Theo is a business user, going back to my scenario, and maybe I work for the sales department, and I'm responsible to create a semantic model that represents the sales subject area, right? So maybe in this case, some of the tables are in maybe my organization has a data warehouse that I have access to, and some of the data could be in files that I maintain, right? So the good thing about technology is that allows us flexibility, but it doesn't shield you from doing bad things. All right, so let's go and connect to my corporate data warehouse real quick. Let's see how far we can get by traveling that path. Now here, another very flexible feature that you won't find in on-prem analysis services and Azure analysis services, the ability to do hybrid models, where some data is imported, some data is left in what we call direct query mode. What does it mean? It means that for best performance, I may decide to import most of my data, but if I have a table that I would like really to be accessible in real time without worrying about refreshing that data, maybe this particular table can be in direct query. So we have some flexibility in here, which is great. So let's go and connect to our SQL Server data warehouse in here and get some tables so we can use them later on. So let's say this is our corporate data warehouse, AdventureWorks. And let's say we're going to import a fact table. IT has already done their job for cleaning the data for me. And I'm very happy as a business user because I don't have to worry about modeling. Maybe introduce product in here. So we have 2 dimension tables and 1 fact table that we're going to import. So you guys probably have done this. There is nothing new here that I'm showing you. But again, I want to emphasize here, if not anything else, is that those are going to be separate tables in the model. I want them to be this way. I'm not going to go and try to combine them together. I'm not going to go to DBA and say, go and join them, give me one data set. I want to keep them apart. And to emphasize the flexibility, I'm also going to let's wait a little bit for this to load. Should be much faster, but presentation always are funny. Cool. So to emphasize also the flexibility of the technology, what about if I have a table that I maintain on my own? So I'm creating the semantic model myself, but I maintain some data in maybe Excel. So I'm going to go to the Excel connector and I'm going to import a list of resellers. So let's say I'm selling some stuff through resell channel. So this is I have my own personal Excel spreadsheet that I maintain for this reseller. So now what I'm doing, I'm combining an Excel data from Excel with data that actually came from SQL Server. And I can do that because once that data is imported, all tables are equal citizens. It doesn't matter what their origin is. So here is my reseller data, what it looks like. I'm going to load it. And I'm going to have my for table, but I don't want this to be talking about user-friendly layer. I don't want this to be called sheet 1. I can rename the metadata in my semantic model to make it more intuitive. One of the first things that I do, and maybe this is something that you guys don't do right now, is that quick as a bunny. Of course, there's a lot of things to do here, things like renaming, things like, hierarchies and stuff like that. But one of the things when it starts to aggregating data, we typically aggregate numeric columns like tax amount, sales amount, right? And obviously we are, interested in taking shortcuts. So what I can do, I can say, okay, I don't need to create a measure here because Power BI Desktop actually, when I select a numeric measure like sales amount, it automatically is going to aggregate it. So this is called implicit measure. You don't write formula, Power BI magically does the aggregation for you. The problem with this approach, actually, there are 2 important problems, probably even more. The first problem is that, remember when I was telling you about Excel being a legacy client, MDX client? If I publish this to Power BI and I connect Excel to it, the users won't be able to do anything with this because Excel does not support implicit measures, right? So if I want to open this model to my business users to create their own reports using Excel or Tableau or something else, then implicit measures are no good, right? And the second thing is that when you get to a little bit more advanced stuff, like calculation groups, This feature does not support implicit measures at all. In fact, if you implement calculation groups, the first thing that it's going to do is going to disable implicit measures. And Microsoft disabled it because when you implement calculation groups, they bypass implicit measures because implicit measures are inline calculations. There is no explicit formulas. So if you implement calculation groups, they're going to bypass implicit measures, and then it's going to be quite a bit of confusion. Why it works for explicit, but it doesn't work for implicit. So Microsoft took the simple kind of a no man, no problem principle here. They said we're going to nuke the implicit measures when you use calculation groups. So how do we create explicit measures? What do we mean by explicit measure? Well, one of the first things that I do here when I have a new model is to rename these base measures, base numeric measures, to, I like to call them base, sales amount based. And I go and hide them, right? And then I go ahead and implement a very simple wrapper measure. And what would that measure do? In this case, it's going to summarize the sales amount base. So now we're going to call this sales amount. That's going to shadow our measure column that we just renamed. And we're going to say this is going to actually summarize the sales amount base column. Does that make sense so far? Cool. Now, moving to the next thing here that you might find interesting is that I don't like Power BI Desktop all that much, to be honest, especially for the things that I do, which are a little bit more complicated. There are typically a lot of tables involved. Don't get me wrong, it's a very slick tool. It has a very nice diagram view, but it suffers the same issue that if you are on the developer side of things, you probably use SQL Server development tools in Visual Studio. And both tools, Power BI Desktop and SSDT, they actually create an analysis services database behind the scenes. So if I am to go to the task manager, and if I go and expand Power BI Desktop, I see in this particular process, there is something called Microsoft SQL Analysis Services. So what happened here? When you install Power BI Desktop, it installs SQL Server Analysis Services behind the scenes, and that gets hosted in this process in here. So the good thing about doing this is that every time I make a change, I can go to the data view, and I can see the data, I can explore it and so forth. The bad things about using this shadow database is that every time I make a change, like a renaming column, creating a measure, you may find that Power BI Desktop gets slower and slower and slower the more tables you start adding. So if you are after development speed, if you want, to create measures, rename columns really, really fast, Power BI Desktop is not the, probably that shouldn't be your main tool. So I'm sorry if I make you confused here. If you like Power BI Desktop, please continue to use it. But what I typically do, I use combination of both. Power BI Desktop, for example, to look at things like diagrams and some other features that we have here. But for everything else, what I'd like to do, I'd like to install a product called Tabular Editor. And if you read the Microsoft documentation, you will see more and more references to the Tabular Editor. Why? Because it supports features that Microsoft doesn't support, like calculation groups. This object level security that just came in is another example. So when you install that community tool, it's a free tool. When you install it, it automatically is going to light up here in this external tools ribbon. And when I click it, it connects automatically to my Power BI desktop model, because this Power BI desktop model is analysis services, Tabular, which is what this tool is designed to use, right? Great. Now the interface here, I'm opening two windows side by side, and as you can see, there is a huge difference. If I'm a novice user, I'm not going to advise you to actually even get to Tabular Editor even near, right? Because it's a little bit more intimidating. There is no wizards here, but it's very, very fast. So if I, for example, go to my factory seller sales, and if I go to sales amount, here is my formula in here. I can go ahead and I can maybe set up a formatting string or something like this, depends on how I want to format it. And the good thing is that when I click save, when I go and do file save, or when I do Control S, the changes are automatically reflected to the Power BI desktop model. So they're synchronized. There are just two different user interfaces pointing to the same semantic model, and it's up to me which way to use. In fact, I can use them interchangeably if I have them open side by side. I can change the calculation here, it's going to be updated here. If I change it here and I save, it's going to be immediately reflected into Power BI Desktop. So that gives me the best of both worlds, right? So we have a question. Does renaming cause any performance hit with the extra query step? So when we rename a column, basically what happens is that you're going to see immediately a step added to the Power Query for renaming of that column. This should be a very simple operation. I haven't came across or kind of heard any issues with renaming. Power Query has its own things to watch about. If you do things like merging, appending queries, those are very memory intensive because Power Query does all these things in memory. Just like if you use SSIS, data flow. So this is the things that probably I would worry about. Renaming column, though, it's a very simple operation. Another thing that I'll worry about in Power Query is that, in fact, this came from a very recent project. So I had a major insurance company. They use Dynamics as they live and die by Dynamics CRM because customer resource management is very important for them. So what they've done, they created a bunch of Power BI desktop models, semantic models on top of Dynamics. The problem with Dynamics, and one issue that I have with the way Microsoft actually have designed it, the cloud version of Dynamics, is that it doesn't give you access to the underlying database, underlying SQL database. You have to go through APIs, or you have to stage the data out. So what this organization has found is that it takes more and more time to refresh millions and millions of records. And we've done a lot of optimizations to speed this up. But we reach a point, it's just that the API is very slow. Unfortunately, if this was a SQL Server database, I could have done filtering on my tables, and that would have been passed to SQL Server. So it will be very efficient. But if I work with data sources like flat files or Dynamics, everything I do, like filtering, that will require loading all the data, maybe potentially millions of activities, before the filter is applied or before some other operations that you do in Power Query are applied. So those are the things that I'm going to worry about in Power Query more than actually renaming the columns, because renaming columns is a very simple op. Okay. So, what else I wanted to show you here? So we talked about explicit measures. We talked about Tabular Editor to speed development. I show you how that works. I actually really like, when I talk about the organizational models in a moment, we're going to do a little bit, we're going to kind of dwell a little bit more in these tools. But okay, so now I want to switch gears a little bit. We've seen how easy it is to create a semantic model for the most part in Power BI Desktop. I want to take the organizational path. So this happens all the time. Like a few months ago, there was a company that hired me to do an assessment. They wanted to start on Power BI. They used MicroStrategy before. Management decided to standardize on Power BI as a single platform. Well, how do we get started with Power BI? And one of the first things that we have to address there is how we do data governance, how we do things like self-service managed BI. You just don't want to turn your users loose, your business users. You want to put some boundaries around it, some oversight. So one thing that came out, remember my conversation in the very beginning when I go to client, ask them, do you have a semantic model? And then they start looking at me and say, do they have semantic model? Okay, so this company actually used MicroStrategy before as a semantic model in this particular case. But typically, the way this works, and many organizations don't do that, they implement data warehouse, and they open it for self-service BI. And my question always has been, if you have gone that far into building a data warehouse, for instance, why don't you go one step further and actually build a what we call organizational semantic model? So what is an organizational semantic model? So uses again the same technology. In fact, I can use Power BI to create an organizational semantic model, but it really boils down to who implements it and what is the vision behind it. And typically, the advice that I give to my clients is that have an organizational BI, have a self-service BI. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment. Organizational BI means data warehouse, implement organizational semantic model, which is the single version of the truth, and then fill the gaps with self-service BI. So let's talk a little bit about this scenario. And it so happened, actually, I was so happy when I read this. A couple of months ago, Microsoft came with a new training for Synapse. It's called Analytics in a Day. It's all about data lake and Synapse and some of those things. And what I found in this training is that Microsoft came to the same realization that I had many, many years ago, that going too much into a self-service BI direction, it's not good, because that's what they decided to do initially. They opened Power BI to everyone in the organization. And then they ended up with complete mess. And the next slide actually talks a little bit about this. But they realized that the solution for solving this mess is a principle called discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge. What does that mean? Well, this is discipline at the core is the organizational BI. IT puts boundaries, creates a data warehouse, creates common dimensions, taxonomies, hierarchies, and KPIs, and organizational semantic model. And then business users, they fill in the gaps with self-service BI. If they want to create additional reports, they can connect to the organizational model. They can mix the data from, let's say, from the data warehouse with their own data. I call this 80-20 principle, but Microsoft called it discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge. Again, what that means is that you will never go wrong by spending effort on improving the data quality, on standardizing those things. Tools come and go. For 15 years or so in BI, I've seen many tools come and go, right? But what remains is that data quality. If you address that, if you clean your data, if you build a data warehouse, if you put your taxonomies, your hierarchies, that's going to actually endure. So in my opinion, as a rough principle, I say 80% should go to the organizational BI, where we do things like data quality, data warehousing. 20% should be left for self-service BI. So what lessons did Microsoft learn by kind of going too much in the self-service BI direction? They ended up with, and this is, by the way, if you want to read about this, here's the link. This is actually documented, what they found. You can just search for discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge, and you're going to see it. But they found inconsistent data being replicated from one model to another, hierarchies are being redesigned, users spend 75% collecting and compiling the data, 78% of reports being created in shadow offline environment, 30 million spent in shadow applications that IT doesn't know anything about. So if this looks familiar to you, or if you're starting on the kind of Power BI path or BI path, avoid these mistakes, right? So how do we avoid these mistakes? I already talked about the role of the data quality, data warehouse, but then we use similar technologies like I showed you, like Power BI or some Tabular Editor, to create an organizational model which has a broader scope. For example, maybe whatever I have in the data warehouse, that can go also in the semantic model. So typically in the data warehouse, I will have multiple subject areas. I will have sales, I will have finance, I will have fact tables, dimension tables. So if you have this, why don't you go one step further and actually build a organizational semantic model which has a bigger scope, because once you build it, you know that this actually can become your single version of the truth. You're going to create your calculations there, your standard metrics, and when users create their own reports or they're going to come from the same place. So it makes sense to actually do it. Now, the question here becomes that I'm typically asked, okay, where do we put the boundary? Maybe my data warehouse, I have hundreds and hundreds of tables. Should I create what I call consolidated semantic model? Consolidated means, imagine you probably won't use Power BI Desktop for if you have so many tables because of the performance issues that I mentioned. But imagine you use Tabular Editor or SQL Server data tools for actually developing this semantic model. So shall I put all of my tables into a single semantic model, single file, or shall I break it down into different semantic models? So there isn't a very definitive answer in there. I personally prefer, based on what I've done, prefer to actually consolidate as much as possible. Why? Because if I start splitting those models apart, I have to duplicate things like dimension tables. Let's say I have a semantic model for finance, semantic model for sales. They're probably going to have similar dimensions, so now I have to duplicate them. So if I make a change in one dimension here, I gotta go and make change in another dimension in there. Then what happens with security? Or actually before even security, what happens if the management says, I want in a single visual, imagine a chart, I wanna see measure for one subject area together with a measure in another subject area. If you have split those into different files, they become like two different universes. There is nothing for you to do that you can do to bring them together into a single place. On the other hand, there could be cases where the the subject areas are so exclusive, maybe finance, it's going to live in its own place for security or whatever reasons. That could be a good case actually to separate them. But I'd like to consolidate. I'd like to, even though I end up with maybe 100 tables or something like that, I would like from consistency to reduce maintenance probably to end up with the same, with just one semantic model, and then use things like perspectives that we have in Tabular, for example, to kind of separate business areas. So if the user who is interested only in sales, they don't have to see the metadata for other subject areas. Theo, there is a question here. What approach did or will you suggest when the corporate has MicroStrategy as a semantic layer is to modernize the DW? So that brings me, that's a very good question, Sanjay, because that's exactly the scenario that actually I was describing before. So I don't have much experience in MicroStrategy, but I can tell you what this client, what kind of issues they run into in MicroStrategy. And the issues were several that you typically hear with other tools. Performance was one of the issues that was quoted. Price was another issue. Price of ownership, price of maintaining it. Talent was another one. You won't find many people familiar with MicroStrategy, right? So it's going to be very hard for you to actually find somebody who's going to maintain and enhance this. So those were some things that were mentioned. And the way they decided to do it for performance reasons, they decided to split the semantic model into multiple places. And they run into these issues that I just talked about. So the advice here would be that as far as the optimization to modernize will be to replace MicroStrategy with Power BI. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by Power BI. So because typically you would use analyst services on-prem or in the cloud. But lately what I do, I actually deploy the semantic models just like self-service ones. I deploy the organizational ones to Power BI. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Okay, so we have another question. How do we convince people who have learned too much into self-service BI not to lean too much? Well, what do? Everything starts with a problem. If they're happy, if your organization is happy with self-service BI, by all means, continue to do what you're doing right now. For example, this insurance company that I mentioned, they actually started with business user creating Power BI desktop files. And to be honest, in their case, a data warehouse for that particular department that I deal with probably is not needed, really. So Power BI against Dynamics might be the way to go. But if you run into any of these issues with, kind of traveling the Microsoft path, then what do? You just point them to that link. This is where we're going. Microsoft has already traveled this painful path, and that's what they learn. So how does it start? It starts top down. Management needs to be proactive. Training, it's very important. I'm not saying that I'm against self-service BI, but users have to be trained to do the right thing. And then, organizational semantic or organizational path, which Microsoft called discipline at the core, can probably help a lot in solving some of these challenges. How can you save the semantic model to a flat file to check into source control? Great question. So this is why I like this Tabular Editor so much, the demo that I showed you before, because you can just go to File, Save As, and what it's going to do is going to generate a BIM file. So let's go ahead and save that. To somewhere. If you're not familiar with BIM file is, this is what SQL Server data tools use, and Tabular Editor for that matter. So what does this file looks like? Well, this is just a JSON file that you can put under source control immediately. So unfortunately, Power BI Desktop right now is not extensible. Remember when I talked about extensibility, I mentioned this is one thing that I don't like. So I cannot do source control directly from Power BI Desktop, but this is the simplest thing that you can do for source control. And by source control, I mean the ability to see what has changed over time in the model. So how do we do that? Save it as a file, put it under source control. You just have to be proactive to do that every time you have a major change or something like that. That's the closest you can go with Power BI and source control. Can you point direct query to a CMS, centralized management server, to run queries across multiple servers and concatenate the results automatically? This is for multiple databases with the same schema on different servers. So I'm not familiar with centralized management server. To be honest, I have to educate myself. But if I have to kind of understand what you're asking here, you are saying maybe I have the same database with the same schema, maybe for multiple customers. So we want to be able to create reports by combining multiple databases together. So there are different ways to solve that, and probably I need to know a little bit more about this. I don't know what CMS does. Maybe it's kind of an aggregator or something like that. I haven't heard that actually can be used as a source of Power BI, but the technology itself allows us to bring multiple tables from different databases in direct query and have heterogeneous joins. It's kind of interesting how it works behind the scenes. For example, you have database A, database B. Something is coming from database A, and some data is coming from database B. Microsoft is trying to do the right thing behind the scenes, depending on how complex the join is. If, for example, I'm doing a query that summarizes revenue by product, and I have a few hundred products, it's going to be easier if Microsoft gets that list and sends it to the second data source. But if the join is huge, what they do, they try to do it in memory. So the technology allows us to do that. I'm just not familiar with exactly what centralized management server does. Maybe there is other ways to solve that. Okay. So this is some of the advantages when we start on the organizational semantic model path. Here are some advantages. Here's why we need to do it. If you hear the term single version of truth, if your management is asking, Theo, implement, whatever you're gonna implement, I don't know if semantic model or something else, but I want when I run report A or B, or users create something to analyze revenue, I want this to produce the same result. That's what this organizational semantic model can do. You can centralize business calculations in one place. It gives you a best report performance. It kind of isolates reports from data warehouse. So if you hear, for example, if you have a database right now, actually, I have a case study that I published a few days ago. I helped the Houston Health Department with COVID. And the interesting thing was that, as you guys know, during the COVID era, lab results exploded, and they use a vendor solution. They use a third-party solution for basically processing lab results and doing some analytics. But because the volumes of data escalated so much, the database vendor has never seen anything before, and they were running into performance challenges, deadlocking. Because they had some huge tables like question and answers. I don't want to go into much details, but eventually they had performance issues that they didn't know how to solve. They were talking to the vendor. The vendor didn't know exactly what was going on, ready to throw the white towel, if you wish. So how do we solve this? If you read that case study, you will see that it was actually very simple to solve it. Number one, we use SQL Server availability group. Because the good thing about the availability group is that you have two copies of the database that are automatically synchronized. That's how the availability group in SQL Server works. It gives you a fault tolerance. It gives you a replication, a real-time replication between two databases. So that allows, the good thing about this, now that you have the database automatically synchronized, is that you can offload some of the report loads into the secondary. So for example, for them to do reporting, they had to crunch data, and that was competing against operational loads. If you have an availability group, you can say reports are going to run on the secondary database, and operational loads can run on the primary database. So right there, they found that the cluster is many more times more performant than the technology they use today. And the final thing, the second step was to implement a semantic model, organizational semantic model, that will give them instantaneous results without hitting the source database. So we didn't build data warehouse. It was just semantic model against the vendor database, and that worked very nicely. So When I talk about this organizational stuff, don't think that you have to implement data warehouses. Typically, every company needs one, but there could be cases where you can just build stuff directly on the data source. So here is the interesting thing now. Okay, Theo is a developer. He implemented a organizational semantic model. Where is Theo going to put that model for people to use it? And we have three options to make things more complicated for you. We've got on-premises analysis services. So if you have a big company that don't want to hear about the cloud, that might be the only choice. You can put it on Azure Analysis Services, which is Analysis Services Tabular running in the cloud if I want to have a cloud solution. Or you can deploy it to Power BI. So let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons. Hopefully this is useful for you, those of you who are kind of on the developer path. SSIS, it's great for on-prem and hybrid deployments. What do I mean by hybrid deployment? So another big organization here in Atlanta. They do baby step in the cloud, but most of their stuff is on-prem. But they want to use Power BI. However, requirement number one since the very beginning is that no data should be resident in Power BI, in Microsoft Data Center, for whatever reasons, security or something else. So how do we do this? We implement SSIS, we implement their data mart, we put Power BI reports. No data is in Power BI. Reports connect with live connections to SSIS on-prem. Now, another good thing about SSIS is that many people believe that by going to the cloud, they're going to save money, right? And based on my experience, that rarely happens, unless you're probably a smaller company, ISV. Why? Because larger companies, they want to have a dev, test, QA, production environments, right? Well, guess what? If I go to the cloud, there aren't many options there. I don't have special price cut if I put development tests. Now, some technologies have SKUs for development, but they're usually so much kind of limited as far as resources, which makes it almost impractical to do anything with this. Whereas if I install SQL Server or analysis services on-prem, all environments except production are free. I don't need to pay anything to Microsoft except provisioning a virtual machine where I'm going to install that. The SQL Server itself, it's free. So that is a big cost motivator for actually people to still be on premises. On the negative side, analysis on premises, it's the lowest SKU. If you think about which SKU gets the most attention, Power BI is number one, Azure Analysis Services maybe number two, SSH, you gotta wait 2 years until there is a new release, hopefully to get some new features. And then it requires Power BI Gateway. This may sound like a no-brainer to you, but I can tell you, I can actually write a book about gateways, all the issues that we have with the gateways. So some organizations actually don't even want to hear about Gateway. Cool. On Azure Analysis Service, now this thing is caught somewhere in the middle. In my opinion, it is not a strategic option because Power BI gets the most attention if you want to be on the latest and on the cloud. And it doesn't give me any cost savings. So I personally haven't done anything with Azure Analysis Services for some time, but it has some advantages. For example, scalability is something that we don't have yet in Power BI. For example, if I want to scale out across multiple servers, I can do that very easily with Analysis Services, Azure Analysis Services, but not with Power BI. But those are very limited scenarios. My preferred approach for self-service and organizational BI is to deploy the semantic models to a Power BI. And this can work in a different way. If I work for a small company or mid-sized company that don't want to go to Power BI Premium or or Premium per user yet, I can use, and let's say they just get started, and the model is not going to be more than 1 gigabyte. They're on the small side of things. I can actually build my model just like what I showed you before. I can use Power BI Desktop. I can use the combination of Power BI Desktop and Tabular, like what I showed you before. And this may work to a point. Of course, Power BI Pro has its own limits, 1 GB maximum dataset size. If I exceed that, that's the end of the story with Power BI Premium. That I gotta think about Premium per user licensing, which might be the next step, or Power BI Premium. And the reason why I like actually deploying to Power BI is that I'm on the latest. All these features that come every month, I get them, if I deploy my model to Power BI. It's all cloud, there is no gateways. I mentioned that on the negative side, larger models will require obviously more money, but I don't think that's because either way you go, you have to pay more money there. This premium per user licensing, by the way, that's going to be great. I'm really excited about this. I just don't know how much it's going to cost. It's currently in preview, but I think that will be great because that will allow small organizations with larger data sets to actually have a nice transition to pay per premium per user. I don't know if you guys know about a premium per user. Maybe we can spend more time if we have time to explain what that means. But essentially, this is the mid licensing between Power BI Pro and Premium. On the negative side, also, I don't like right now we are boxed into plans. If you're in Power BI Premium, you have a P1, P2, Microsoft gives you a hardware. What about if I need more memory but less CPU? Can't do it, right? So it's not that flexible, unfortunately, as it stands right now. But as I said, Power BI Service will be my first option for self-service and organization. Everything on another actually reason will be that everything is going to be under one umbrella. So what about development? If we are to develop this organizational semantic model, then what tool do we use? Typically, developers would gravitate toward Visual Studio and something called SSDT, SQL Server Data Tools that are included in Visual Studio. In a nutshell, the reason why I avoid it is the same reason that I avoid Power BI Desktop. It has insane number of bugs. Essentially what Microsoft did with SSDT, they said, wait a minute, we have this technology in Excel called Power Pivot. Let's now bring it to the organizational world. So they got Power BI, Power Pivot from Excel, they put it in Visual Studio one-to-one, and they say, this is your development environment. That's why sometimes when you run into error, you will see Excel generating an error or something like this. So the main issue that I have with that, with SSDT, is just very slow because it has this background database. We call it workspace database there. Everything you do has to commit against this database. So what I typically do, I use either combination of SQL Server data. Oh, another limitation of SQL Server data tools is that it's designed for analysis service on-prem. So it doesn't support the latest and greatest features that you have in Power BI. So instead of that, I use predominantly Tabular Editor for development. And that works usually pretty well. What is the difference in similarity? Actually, let me finish this slides, guys, and then I'm going to get to the questions because I have only one slide left here, something else that I wanted to show you. So this organizational semantic model is great. I can tell you that whatever I do, one way or the other, kind of gravitates toward that path, organizational semantic model. But previously had a very important limitation, which is not just for the organizational, but also for self-service semantic models. And the limitation was that, and actually to demonstrate that, I could open another instance of Power BI Desktop here. So imagine Theo has built a organizational semantic model, or Eric has built a self-service semantic model. We deploy them to Power BI, and life is great. So if that's an organizational, users can go and create reports. They can see existing reports, single version of the truth. Everything is great until users decide to customize the semantic model. What do I mean by customization? They say, great, Theo, you build this great foundation for us, but we want to bring our own data, kind of combine it with your semantic model. And this could be as simple as the user maintains some kind of a categories. Maybe there is a product dimension, but this user has its own category of products that care about. So he maintains that in an Excel file or a text file, and now he wants to incorporate this. Previously, and I'm going to demonstrate this by connecting to a Power BI dataset that I already deployed to powerbi.com. So let's say I'm a business user. I come in here and I say, Theo has created a semantic model and he told me about this. I'm very happy. I'm going to actually start creating reports from it. So they connect to it and they see all the dimensions that we imported in the fact tables, and they can start creating reports. But the user wants to do, in this case, comparison between actual and budget. And the user maintains its own budget data into Excel or text file. Previously, if the user attempts to bring another data source while Power BI Desktop is connected to a Power BI dataset, that will be the end of the road. All of these things here are going to be grayed out, and you're going to get a message that once you have a live connection to Power BI dataset, that's pretty much the end of the story. Now we could actually, let's see what's going to happen. Let's say, just for you guys to understand the scenario, let's say here is my file that I maintain. So I have a text file in here, and that's for budget. The month, let's say I maintain by employee, doesn't matter here, or I have this is the quarter. So this is something that I maintain, right? Let's see what's going to happen with this new enhancement. By the way, I think this is still a preview feature, so make sure you go to options and enable. Let's take a look here. I'm pretty sure it's still in preview. It's called direct query for, if I go to the preview feature, it's called direct query for Power BI datasets and analysis services. So make sure you select this. Otherwise, you're going to see the old behavior. That's going to be the end of the road for you. But if you enable this guy, then let's see what's going to happen. So now I go to get data and I go to a text file. At this moment, what Power BI Desktop is going to ask you, wait a minute, you have a live connect.
Cannot hear you.
Sorry, guys, can you hear me?
Now we can.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
we can hear you now.
Don't know what happened. What was the last thing you guys heard?
It was about 15 minutes ago. We've been waiting here.
You were waiting for 15 minutes?
Yeah, you just started to explain the dialog box
No.
The dialog, which dialog box?
on the top, the one that's up there right now.
Oh, that's okay. Okay, so okay, so I was explaining that in Power BI we have 3 connection types. We have an import, we have direct query, and we have something called live connection. When you connect Power BI Desktop to any flavor of analysis services, such as published dataset, you know, Azure analysis services or on-prem analysis services, Power BI Desktop says, wait a minute, I don't need to introduce any layers in between because that data source knows about DAX. So it's going to remove everything in between, and it's going to become like a thin presentation layer on top of analyst services. So it's going to generate DAX queries. There is no Power Query. There is nothing in between. So obviously, the advantage there is that you have a little bit better performance. But when you, with this new feature, which is called direct query, when you decide to mash up data from your Power BI data set, let's say, and something else, then it's going to ask you immediately, wait a minute, we see that we have a live connection. To allow you to do this feature, we got to switch you to direct query. And that's what the new feature does. What the new feature does, if you accept this prompt, is going to introduce another layer, just like when we connect to SQL Server via direct query, is going to cache the metadata of the remote model inside Power BI Desktop, and is going to then do kind of interesting joins. So let's just finish this scenario. Let's say I'm going to take the prompt, I'm going to take this new path, and so that it allows me to mash up my own data with that remote model that somebody else created. So now I can go ahead and bring my text file in here, and let's see what's going to happen. Well, it's going to let me do it. It's going to say, yeah, this is a text file. Go ahead and load it. And I'm going to go ahead and load it. So just for you to understand, and this probably is going to become a little bit clearer. Let's go and tick OK here. Let's go and switch to once this is done. If you look here on the left side, this is where we started. We had only 2 tabs. Now we have magically a 3rd tab for the data view. But if we go to the relationships window, what really happened here? So most of my tables come from a data set in Power BI that somebody else published. Organizational, self-service, doesn't matter. So all of these tables highlighted in blue, I cannot make any changes to these tables. I cannot go and change relationships. In fact, if I try to remove a relationship, nothing is going to pop up here and that makes sense because this is a model maintained by somebody else. But this table that I brought in here, that actually came from something that I maintain. And I can create a join. I could now say, okay, this is maybe another fact table in here, and that joins to the date table. So let's go ahead and join on the date column. And I believe in the Adventure Works that was called full date alternate key, the date column. So I can go ahead and actually create a join. That's a very powerful thing. This is a huge feature because, again, the business value for you is that now your data sets in Power BI, they are not locked. Users can enhance them with their own data. They can actually go and create their own things and publish them in there. And if you find this useful, then maybe you can enhance your model to have that table so they don't have to do it anymore. These joins here are very interesting, the way now they resolve this. Actually works similar to direct query. Microsoft figures out what is the most efficient way to resolve that join between, in this case, 2 data sources on the fly. There are some undisclosed rules that they use here, but essentially if the join is small, for example, if I have not many items in this new table, then it's going to be sent all the way to analyst services. If not, they're going to attempt to do it in memory, actually. Bring the data from one place, bring it from analyst services, mash it up in memory to resolve that join. So you don't have to know anything about this, of course. The downside is that you are introducing another layer in between. There is no way to remove that layer. Once you have it, that's it. You cannot go back to direct live connection unless you recreate your Power BI desktop file, of course. And that actually introduces some performance overhead that I don't think that I've read anything how big that is at this point. So that was it. That's from me. That's what I wanted to share. Hopefully some of these tips were useful. Maybe we kind of re-emphasized the obvious. To wrap this up, in my opinion, every organization needs organizational semantic model. Maybe not almost every, that's why I said almost every here. Definitely think about this discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge. Think about the middle path, right? If you err too much on the self-service BI, you're going to end up with the same mistakes that Microsoft went through, right? If you err too much on the organizational BI, it probably is going to be very rigid because you got to wait for developers and IT to actually meet your requirements, right? So the middle path typically works the best, depending on your scenario. I already talked about the download file here. I kind of sent you the link, how to get in touch with me if you need help or follow my blog and so forth. So let's get back to the questions here and see what we've got. We have about 10 minutes. Let's see where we stop. Okay. We talk about renaming. Does not MS Dynamics use SQL Server behind the scenes? I remember pulling data directly, but that was a while back. So absolutely, Microsoft Dynamics actually uses SQL Server, and if you install it on-prem, then no problem. You can connect to that SQL Server any way you want. But if you go with Microsoft Dynamics Online, this is where you're going to find that Microsoft does not allow you to connect directly to that SQL Server database. So that's a big difference. And that complicates the thing significantly because what Microsoft is going to tell you is that if you want to get the data out, you have to stage it to a data lake. And once you stage it to a data lake, now think about this. I mean, this is what I don't like. You have the data stored in a perfect store. If I have it in a relational server, this is the best place my data can be. If I want to filter it, if I want to do where clauses, everything is going to be passed to SQL Server. Performance is going to be great. Now we're going to stage data out of a data lake, which becomes a bunch of flat files. The only way for me to do filtering, imagine you go to Power BI Desktop, you go to Power Query, you connect to these flat files, and I want to filter only the data for this year and last year. What do you think Power Query is going to do? It's going to load all the data before you can apply the filter. So this is a horrible, horrible architecture. So how do we solve this issue? Is to introduce Synapse in the mix. So now we've got Dynamics to Data Lake to Synapse. And Synapse has a feature called SQL, I don't know. If you want, you can travel that path. In my opinion, it's a very convoluted path. So my advice will be for you, if you're in the same situation, there is a tool called Data Export, which is free, although Microsoft doesn't advise you use it anymore or use a third-party tool to get the data out of Dynamics and put it into another SQL Server database. And if you work for a bigger company, please complain to Microsoft, just like I do, that we should have direct access to that database. That's exactly what Dmitry was saying. Okay. Theo, what approach did or will you suggest when we talk about MicroStrategy? How do we convince people who have learned too much? Okay, we talked about that as well. How can you save the semantic? Okay, we talked about that. Can you point direct query to us? Okay, talk about this. What is the difference and similarity between semantic model and tabular model? Well, let's go back and rewind. But essentially, semantic model is a fancy name of a tabular model. Now, we may not be very technical correct here because here, when I talked about the different paths you can take, there are different flavors of semantic modeling. But since I said that 90% plus I use tabular, we can say that semantic model and tabular and either one of its flavors, Power BI, SSS, Azure Analysis Services, it's pretty much one and the same thing in Microsoft BI. Semantic model, tabular model, they are the same thing. Sorry for the confusion there. Unless, of course, you take a multi-dimensional path. Power BI service is the same as the one in Office 365 E5, right? Okay, so Power BI service is where we deploy if you use Power BI, you deploy your files, your organizational or self-service semantic models, you deploy them to powerbi.com, right? So this is a cloud software as a service technology that Microsoft maintains for you. So going back to the question, Power BI service. So Power BI service comes with different licensing. If I'm a small organization, I can decide to license per user, which means every user I have to license and I have to pay Microsoft $10 per user per month if they want to get access to shared reports. For small organizations, that might be fine. And your question about E5, the question becomes, well, if I use Office 365 already, is it anything smarter that I can do than continue paying Microsoft $10 per user per month? And the answer is, if your organization is on Office 365 E5 plan, you will find that Power BI Pro, this $10 per user per month, is included in the license, right? In your Power BI, in your Office 365 E5 plan. It comes with limitations. This Pro, and I mentioned 1 gigabyte is the most significant one. You cannot have a data set more than 1 gigabyte, a single file that is bigger than 1 gigabyte. And if that's the case, then we can progress into something called premium per user, which is something that is in preview right now. Microsoft has introduced this a couple of months ago, where I still license per user, but then I also unlock Power BI premium features. The only thing is that we don't know how much this is going to cost because, as I mentioned, I'm really excited about this option. Hopefully, it's not going to be more than double the price, $20 per user per month. And if you're working for larger organizations, you can say, forget about this per user license. I have so many users. If I license them per user, I got to pay a lot of money with Microsoft. So then you can say, I'm going to pay like a flat fee, starting with $5,000 per month to Microsoft. And then I can have these viewers these users that will only view reports, they all can be licensed starting at that price point. So there is a lot of things to talk here about licensing, but to answer your question, if you have Office 365 E5 plan, and if you want to do Power BI Pro, you don't have to pay anything more. It's included in this plan. What is the difference in similarity between semantic and tabular? Already answer it. Just lost audio. Is it possible to combine two tabular models using this method? Yes, it's possible to combine two tabular models. So Microsoft talks about chaining models. In fact, you can have a model that is built on a model, kind of you can nest it, and also you can build two tabular models. The only limitation that I know of here is that you cannot, that feature is not supported for SSIS on-prem. So this composite model that I showed you at the end, it's only for Azure now services and Power BI datasets, which is another reason why I want to actually push everything to Power BI. If you're using SSIS on-prem, you cannot mesh it up with other data. Does not apply. Any idea when source control is coming to Power BI without needing Tabular Editor? I have no idea. I'm sure there is a ask for it. You can take a look at ideas.powerbi.com, maybe vote for it. Not seeing your screen. Well, I'm sharing. So do you guys see my screen? You should see Eric there and, and Reynold. Now you should see the slide. Very nice. What else we've got in here? They will be announcing the pricing tomorrow at Ignite. Very well, Damo. Looking forward to it. So tomorrow at Ignite, we're gonna hear how much premium per user is going to cost. Do you guys have any other questions? We are a little bit on top of the hour. Anything you want to ask me? Have you tried? If I publish 2 tabular models to PowerBI.com, become Power BI dataset, connect them that way, would that be possible? I'm pretty sure this is going to work, this composite feature. So give it a try. If not, maybe I can follow up with you. You can send me a question. I can follow up with the Microsoft, see what's the deal with that. Thank you, gentlemen. Guys, do you guys have any questions? 1, 2, 3, no questions.
I added one more.
Go ahead. Oh,
Just
one
curious
more.
if anyone has experience bringing Informix data into Power BI reports.
I personally haven't. So this Informix is one data source that I haven't dealt with. Does anybody have any experience? In fact, I'm not sure if we have an Informix driver. I'm sure we don't, but maybe we can go through ODBC or ODBPath. Anybody with real-time experience with Informix? I guess not. I would advise you to pose the question on the community forum of Power BI. We have a very good community. Microsoft actually looks at those questions. Pause it there and see what the community is going to say about it. You're going to have much bigger reach than this group. Well, if you guys don't have any more questions, thank you so much. I'm going to pause this again once the recording is done in an hour. I'm going to put it in the Atlanta BIRX website that I share with you. I'm going to see you hopefully on April 5th. That's going to be our next one. Until then, stay safe and change the world with Power BI.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. Bye-bye.